Good evening and welcome to the John Smith Centre. My name's Kezia Dugdale and I'm the Director. We at the John Smith Centre exist to make the positive case for politics and public service, and we do that in three key ways. Firstly, by doing pioneering research into what the public think about their politicians and their public servants. We do it through our internship and development programmes, supporting young people to break through the structural barriers that so many young people face accessing public life. And we also do it through advocacy and events like tonight's, showcasing the very best of politics and politicians. And there's something suitably wry about us meeting on Guy Fawkes night, I think. On a night which marks a famous but foiled attempt to burn down the House of Parliament, we choose to spend an hour or so discussing one of the greatest figures to serve within it. And we do so with our guest this evening, who is, of course, an accomplished author, historian, and politician in his own right. Lord Adonis is going to introduce his wonderful latest book, Labour's Churchill, available here, and you can see he's offering to sign copies in the chat forum over the next 20 minutes or so, after which I will selfishly pose some questions of my own before turning to you for questions from the audience. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions in advance of tonight's event. If you'd like to pose one during the course of the event, it's not too late. You can do that by typing it into the chat forum, and that will come through to our team of moderators here at the John Smith Centre, and we'll monitor that as the evening progresses. Andrew, it's such a real pleasure to welcome you to the Centre tonight. Please take us on a journey into the life of Labour's Churchill.
Well, Kezia, it's great to be with you this evening, and welcome to all those who have, on a cold bonfires night, have decided to join us rather than lighting. You can't light the bonfires, can you? Whatever else you might do in the privacy of your garden. It's very good to be with you. At one level, it's slightly odd to be talking about Ernie Bevin to a Scottish audience, or what I take to be a largely Scottish audience, and it's also great to be talking to the John Smith Centre because he was a great political hero of mine in times past. Because, of course, Ernie Bevin himself, as far as I could tell, had almost no relationship with Scotland. I was busy hunting through the book of my Ernie Bevin records to try and find some good juicy Scots anecdotes, and I can't really find any. There were a few conferences which he spoke at in Scotland, because actually then, interestingly, both the Labour Party and the TUC, the British TUC, held their annual conferences in Scotland much more frequently than they do now. The Labour Party, Ernie's great speech denouncing fascism and the great Mussolini and Hitler, and predicting that there would be war unless they were stood up to, was made at the Edinburgh Labour Party conference of 1937. So there was he was there quite frequently for big conferences, but he and of course his union, the Transport and General Workers Union, was a big union in Scotland too, hugely important union in Scotland. Indeed, just as it was the biggest union in Britain by the late 1930s, it must therefore, I assume, have been the biggest union in Scotland as well. But he didn't have any Scottish ancestry. He didn't have any particular Scots friends. The only Scot that I can see he worked with particularly closely was Ramsay MacDonald, and he didn't like him at all. I mean, there was a really serious antipathy between the two of them, going back well before the 1931 split into the 1920s, because Ramsay MacDonald was pretty hostile to trade union leaders. Interestingly, the Independent Labour Party, then oddly, when you think about how things are now, the Independent Labour Party was seen as being to the left of the trade unions. The trade unions were regarded by quote unquote socialists as being very dodgy in their political affiliations, because so many of them had historically been liberal and weren't until quite late in the day affiliated to the Labour Party, and were also quite semi-detached in terms of engagement with parliamentarians. Ramsay MacDonald was extremely hostile to the big trade union leaders, and became even more so after the general strike of 1926. So there was no love lost between them at all, and there was a really serious breach, of course, in 1931. And the closest spiritual relationship I can find, actually, but it is a very interesting one, is with Keir Hardie himself, because Keir Hardie, who first comes to prominence organising the air miners' strike of the early 1880s, I think it's 1881, which is an absolutely seminal moment in the growth of the trade union movement and indeed the labour movement in both Scotland and in Britain. A little known fact is that Keir Hardie's associate in organising that strike was a guy called Andrew Fisher, who was then only an 18-year-old. And after the strike, when both he and Keir Hardie were blacklisted, which was quite common then in strikes, in the really fiercely hostile environment there was between employers and trade unionists, particularly trade unionists who were organising strikes in the late 19th century, he was blacklisted. As a result of Andrew Fisher becoming blacklisted, he emigrates to Australia. And the really interesting thing, about which I could write a whole book separate to this one, is when he emigrates to Australia, he gets very involved both to begin with in Australian trade union politics, mining trade unionism, but then in the Australian Labour Party, and he is the first leader of the Labour Party who wins an overall majority in the Australian Parliament. So in many ways, he's the seminal figure. He's a kind of Attlee figure in Australian politics. And what's so interesting about it is, of course, if he'd continued in British politics, that probably wouldn't have happened. He probably wouldn't have been able to get to the top of the Labour Party. Ernie Bevin is as close as you get. Ernie Bevin could just possibly have become leader of the Labour Party, but it's probably the case he chose not to because he was so loyal to Attlee. But the interesting thing is that Ernie Bevin goes through an almost identical experience, which tells you so much about the British class system and the antipathy that there was going well into the 20th century between employers and trade unions. When Ernie Bevin comes to prominence in Bristol, in the city of Bristol, where after his extraordinarily deprived childhood, leaves school at 11, orphan at the age of 8, never knows who his dad is, mum dies of cancer at 8. And then he flees from being a farm boy, literally, only with the 3 hours from school, from rural West Somerset to go to Bristol with nothing other than the names of his 2 elder brothers. So the names and addresses of his 2 elder brothers, and he lodges with one and works in the same butcher shop as the other. But he comes to prominence in Bristol because he's one of the organisers of the 1910 Bristol dock strike. And that leads to huge animosity in the politics of Bristol. At that stage, there are no Labour members of the local council, and the Liberals who are on the council, which we think of the Liberals as being a more left-wing party, but then the relations between Labour and the Liberals are almost as bad as between Labour and the Tories, in some ways worse, because the big Liberals were the big employers. And Ernie Bevin by then is essentially a sole trader. He's delivering mineral water he's a drayman on a wagon, a horse and cart around Bristol. And after the 1910 dock strike, the big employers of Bristol, including the big hotels and others on whom he's utterly dependent, start boycotting him. They do their equivalent of a blacklist. They refuse to buy mineral water from him, and he very nearly loses his entire livelihood. And while that's happening, he thinks seriously about emigrating. Comes very close. He's a Baptist lay preacher, and which again, Labour owes more to Methodism than to Marxism is absolutely true. And you look at this generation of trade union leaders, certainly true of Ernie. He was going around in his horse and cart singing hymns at the top of his voice. That's what he did. But he goes into a deep depression and has a breakdown in 1910, and very nearly leaves the country. So the story of Andrew Fisher in the Miners' Federation of Scotland in the early 1880s as the right-hand man of Keir Hardie almost becomes Ernie Bevin's story too. And that tells you so much about the class politics and trade union politics and the early Labour politics of Britain before the First World War. But Ernie stays by the skin of his teeth. He then becomes an organiser, a full-time organiser, paid organiser for the Dockers Union during the First World War. Therein lies a story of its own. Because he's a full-time organiser for the Dockers Union, he isn't called up because full-time organisers are exempt, and that may have saved his life, because if he'd been called up, and gone to the trenches, he may not have survived at all. Instead of it, he actually has the most amazing break in 1916, which is the year of the Somme. Because in the year of the Somme, he's now the number 3 in the Dockers Union as one of their big national organisers. And he goes to his first TUC conference, and he goes to it only because it happens to be held in Bristol. And the last item of business in the TUC conference in Bristol is to elect their delegates to go, fraternal delegates, to go to the American Federation of Labor, which is the big American TUC equivalent, which was being held in San Francisco. And there's no competition for the posts because the Lusitania has just been sunk and people think that you may not even survive the experience of crossing the Atlantic. So 34-year-old Ernie Bevin puts his name forward and goes, and this is an absolutely life-changing experience for him. He sees the big America, he sees the American Federation of Labor, which is far in advance of anything the TUC or the Dockers Union have got in terms of organisation. He meets Sam Gompers, who's one of these huge, burly, larger-than-life, massive sort of business union type figures. He visits his 8-story, he goes to the opening of the American Federation of Labor's 8-story headquarters on Massachusetts Avenue, just down the road from the White House in Washington, which is what gives him the idea for setting up 10 years later what becomes Transport House in London, which is modelled on the American Federation of Labour. And it also, interestingly, gives him a lifelong and really serious knowledge. He's an expert, Ernie Bevin, on international labour questions. He knows more about the United States and trade unionism and labour relations and industrial relations in the United States than anyone else in Britain, because he goes frequently in the interwar years too. He becomes a delegate to the International Labour Organization, which is based in Geneva, goes there every year, becomes one of their leading figures in the 1930s, which takes him to the continent a lot as well, including to Germany, where he is in 1932 and nearly gets beaten up by the fascists in a Bierstube in, I think it's in Lüneburg. So as a result of his experience during the war, he not only becomes a prominent Dockers Union leader, but he also becomes a serious internationalist. And actually, when people say, and I used to use this joke about Ernie Bevin when I was talking about it before I started writing this book, that when he arrived in the Foreign Office in 1945, there were only 2 posts he could have held in the Foreign Office. One was Foreign Secretary and the other was doorkeeper. Though that's a very good joke, and it's certainly true that the aristocratic dominated Foreign Office didn't have many people with Ernie Bevin's background, it was also true that of all the people in the Foreign Office, both ministers and also diplomats, there were very few who actually knew more about international affairs and knew more about the people engaged in international affairs, which is what this great post-war settlement was all about, with the United Nations, the fight against communism and fascism and all of that, than Ernie Bevin. And he was remarkably well equipped for the posts he held as a minister by virtue of his extraordinary trade union experience. Anyway, that brings us to the First World War. After the First World War, there's a huge, essentially big industrial breakdown in Britain. It's important to understand that the effects of the 1917 revolution and Lenin and communism in Russia, combined with the loss of the war by Germany and a total social breakdown across most of the continent, exacerbated by, to a scale which I only now appreciate after this year, by swine flu. More people are killed by swine flu after the First World War than are killed in all of the fighting of the First World War. And indeed, actually, the latest research suggests that part of the reason why Germany collapses so suddenly in the autumn of 1918 is because Germany and Austria suffer from Spanish flu, as it's then called, the Spanish flu, earlier and more seriously than Britain, the Americans, and France. And there's this massive social breakdown, really serious industrial strife, including in Britain, because it didn't turn into a communist type revolution in Britain in 1920-21. People discount the degree of the industrial breakdown there was. A third, to give you an idea of how serious it was, a third of all working days in British industry in 1920-21 are lost by strikes. And this deep endemic breakdown in relations between employers and workers, with big and quite militant unions, the biggest of them then in the 20s, it changes when Ernie Bevin runs the Transport and General Workers Union in the 30s, but in the 20s, the biggest union is the Miners' Union. Nearly 1 million people are engaged in mining in the early 1920s, before the first big pit closures, which happened quite early after the general strike. And the Miners' Union is run by the communists. It's quite interesting. There's so many echoes of what happens in the interwar period, what happens in the big industrial breakdowns of the 1970s and 80s. But a very passionate communist a bit like Arthur Scargill, is the General Secretary of the Miners' Union in the 20s. And it's a very uneasy relationship between him and the dockers, because the dockers, Ernie Bevin is a passionate anti-communist, because he sees quite early on from his experience in the Dockers Union that that communism and democracy are simply incompatible, that as soon as communists take over any organization, democracy goes through the window, including in the Miners' Federation, which he'd seen, where elections are largely abolished afterwards. Again, echoes of Arthur Scargill, who wasn't very keen on elections for strike action or anything in the 1980s either. So there's quite a big divorce that starts between the communist-run trade unions and the socialist-run trade unions, which of course Bevin becomes one of the largest leaders of. And he becomes a particularly big leader after his big decisive move in 1921 to 22, when he expands the Dockers Union to amalgamate with 14 other unions. It was a huge diplomatic move that he undertakes to form the Transport and General Workers Union, which is the first big cross-trade union. The reason why these organizations are called trades unions is for a reason, that historically they'd all been organized around specific trades, and most of them quite small. And it was a revolutionary idea, which Ernie learned from the Americans, that the effectiveness of a union was likely to be far greater if it had, to be blunt about it, just more members and had more industrial heft by bringing trades together. And that's what the Transport and General Workers Union did, which was revolutionary in the trade union and labour politics of the 1920s, is it brought not only dockers, but road haulage workers, which was a big growing sector as the road industry starts developing in the 1920s, all of the trades allied to the docks, including the carters, as they were called, all of the people doing the transport to and from the docks, which is where Ernie Bevin himself had come from. It's how he got involved in the Dockers Union before the First World War. He brings all of these together with a lot of other smaller unions too, which are loosely related, but not necessarily particularly closely related. The early chemical industry is also unionized by Ernie. That's why it's called the Transport and General Workers Union, because he's busy organizing them too. And it's that leads to what becomes, after the collapse of the miners through the failure of the general strike of 1926, becomes the biggest union, not just in Britain in the 1930s, but the biggest trade union in the free world. And that is very largely Ernie Bevin's creation. It is an enormous act of genius, vision, willpower, and organizing capacity. And Ernie's first serious biographer, who's a man called Francis Williams, who's a very significant figure in labour history because he was Attlee's press spokesman after 1945 and very close to Clement Attlee, but a huge admirer of Ernie Bevin's because Ernie Bevin had been a great supporter of Attlee's in the 1920s and through the wartime coalition after 1940. In the first biography of Bevin, which Francis Williams writes, which is published in 1952, just a year after Ernie's death, it's very intriguing this. He likens Bevin in his organizational and leadership capacity to Joseph Stalin. And he says the two are very similar, this extraordinary force of personality and sheer relentless organizing capacity in working class institutions and particularly unions is very similar to Stalin in the early years after 1917, when he's essentially Lenin's organizer-in-chief. He says the big difference is that basically Ernie loved human beings, whereas Stalin hated them. What Stalin wanted was dominance, but didn't give a fig for the sanctity of life, let alone human rights, democracy, or anything of that kind. He was a Stalinist. And that's why he couldn't see an election without wanting to abolish it and to dominate any organization by simply seizing power. Whereas Ernie, though he had was a massive ego and was in many ways, you certainly, unless you were a very close associate who he had respect for, and he didn't have respect for very many people. It was basically Churchill, Attlee, and a few others. He could be absolutely impossible. Nonetheless, he basically loved human beings. This Christian background that he had was very, very profound, even when he stopped being a regular churchgoer in the 1920s. And he had a very strong sense of human values, human life. He was a humanist, essentially, really cared passionately about his members. He was well in advance of his time, even for the trade union movement of the time, in terms of not only organising for pay and conditions, but for the wider social conditions of his members. He set up a whole network of care homes for elderly T&G members, retired T&G members in the 1920s and 30s, because of the fact there wasn't then any proper system of there were rudimentary old age pensions, but not much more. He was the first president of the Working Class Travel Association, as it was called, the Workers' Travel Association in the 1930s, because he took the view that all workers needed decent holidays. He negotiated the 40-hour working week convention at the International Labour Organization in the 1930s, and he turned up at the travel industry and told them that what they were offering the workers for their holidays, or holidays as he called them, was completely unacceptable. And he told them what they should be doing. And he not only was present at the opening of the first Butlins on the Welsh West Coast in, I think it was 1937, but he persuaded Butlin to set it up. I mean, he was well in advance of his time. He tried to persuade the T&G to negotiate hard for what we now call occupational pensions. But he failed. He couldn't get his executive to go with it because they said, what's the point of doing these things? We all die a year or two after we retire. But he was well ahead of his time on that, and seeing the importance as workers lived longer and had longer retirements, and seeing that they had a much more secure financial future. The only thing, which I hate to say this with Kezia looking at me in the corner of my screen, the only thing he was very bad at, and he was very bad at it, was women's rights. He was totally antediluvian. And in the war, even when he played an important role in persuading women's organisations to go with female conscription, which happens in 1941, all unmarried women in their 20s were conscripted in the 1920s for civilian work, not military conscription. Even after that, he refused to support equal pay, saying that the men would find this completely unacceptable. And when an amendment was carried, one of the very few occasions where the Churchill coalition was defeated in the House of Commons during the war, when an amendment was carried to the 1944 Education Bill to provide for equal pay for men and women teachers, because of course lots more women teachers came forward during the war because the men were largely fighting. It was at Bevin's insistence, Churchill made it a matter of confidence that the vote was reversed. So I'm afraid he wasn't ahead of his time on that. Then to complete the story, because I've almost been speaking for too long, that's the 1920s and 30s. He essentially makes Attlee leader of the Labour Party in 1935 by moving against the Jeremy Corbyn of the 1930s, who he gets out as leader in 1935, who'd been a pacifist, and puts Attlee in there. Major Attlee, as he was called, a good war record and all of that, and they stand shoulder to shoulder through the debates on essentially pacifism, which was Labour's stance until the late 1930s. When Churchill becomes leader and Prime Minister in May 1940, the one person he tells Attlee he wants from the Labour side is Ernest Bevin, who he'd been on the other side of in the general strike when Churchill was busy organising the government side, because he understands not only that Bevin is a brilliant organiser, but that he's also a first-rate patriot as well. And he becomes Minister of Labour. He's parachuted into the House of Commons. One chapter of the book goes through his contribution to the war, and in the view of most people at the time, including both Churchill and Attlee, the person making the second biggest impact on winning the war from 1940 to 45 is Ernest Bevin, because of his huge success in mobilising the trade unions and the labour movement behind the war effort, with very, very low levels of strike action and disaffection. Ironically, the area where there's the biggest disaffection is the Bevin boys, who are the conscripts who are literally sent down the mines because there's a big crisis of coal production in 1944 to 45. But that wasn't a problem of relations with the union. That was a problem of people who basically just didn't want to get anywhere near mining, which was understandable. And then in 1945, he becomes Foreign Secretary, and he essentially sees off Stalin, keeps Stalin out of Western Europe after 45. And he's absolutely central in the creation of NATO, the the Atlantic Alliance, and the formation of the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949. Because what Ernie sees with a very great clarity after 1945 is that Soviet Stalinist communism is as bad as Hitlerite fascism. They are two sides of the same authoritarian coin. And of course, Stalin was imperialist in his mentality. He wanted to move as far into Western Europe as he could, because his natural instinct was always to dominate. And it's Ernie Bevin's very, very skillful diplomacy, plus toughness of purpose and understanding of communism, well ahead actually of most of the Labour Party at the time, where there were lots of people who thought we should have a peace deal with Stalin and have a neutral Germany governed by Britain, America, and Russia equally, with American troops going back to America. That very nearly happened, but for Ernie Bevin, it probably would have happened in 1947-48 until Truman moves decisively in the anti-communist direction, which is largely because of Ernie Bevin. And that brings us to 1950. His last year, alas, is very sad. He suffers from really serious heart conditions, and he effectively dies in the job in April 1951. Attlee has to take him out of the Foreign Office 6 weeks before because he just simply can't do the job. But he keeps him in the office as Lord Privy Seal, which is a non-departmental office. He still lives in One Carlton Gardens, the Foreign Secretary's residence. And on one Saturday morning in early April, Flo, his wife, goes off to Wembley to watch the football, and she comes back and Ernie has had a massive heart attack in bed. But, and this tells you so much about his absolute dedication to work and to the end, she finds him in bed with his ministerial red box open next to him and his key to his red box clasped vice-like in his hands. So he dies on the job. There you are. That's Ernie Bevin in 26 minutes.
34 years of public service in 26 minutes. That's quite an effort, Andrew. Thank you so much. What a wonderful overview of what was undoubtedly a phenomenal life. I've got a few questions of my own, but just to encourage those people who are tuning in tonight that they can still ask questions directly to you by writing them into the Q&A box at the foot of their screens. Those are very welcome. We'll put those to Andrew as we commence. I'm going to ask you in a second, what was key to his success, but you did touch in your overview there about women's rights, and I can't resist the temptation to pick that up with you because, of course, so much of the Labour 45 experience and the story of the government of 45 is a very masculine one. But I noted from the book there was one prominent thing that his wife contributed to the war effort. Do you want to tell us what Flo insisted would happen in the factories during the war?
Yeah, Flo was very keen on canteens and having proper support for children, creches at the time, and children's centres. And because she'd been an early socialist, Flo, though she gives up a career when she marries Ernie and never works again, they'd met in the Bristol Socialist Society, and she maintains those convictions all the way through. And there it is a kind of slightly it's not a political partnership in the sense of both of them being engaged in politics, but they talked politics a lot, and she was on the issue of women's rights. She was far in advance of Ernie, though that wasn't hard. Thanks
for that. So it feels apt in a week where so much of the world is talking about US politics, Andrew, that we focus for a second on a quote in the book coming from one of the 3 US Secretary of States that Ernie works with throughout his life, and that was Dean Acheson. And he said that of Bevin that he could lead and learn at the same time, and to work with him was inevitably evoked deep affection, respect and trust from his staff. And in the paragraphs that follow that, you also reflect on the fact that his private secretary from one year to another was always told that their most important job was to make sure that he didn't work himself to death. And repeatedly throughout the book, the staff who've worked alongside him say he was undoubtedly the best ever chief that they worked with. So I wondered, reflecting on his life, what leadership qualities did he have? What made him so likeable but still able to command such respect and to lead in the way that he did?
That's a very interesting question, which I know is at the heart of what the John Smith Centre does. He had very great, but slightly unusual leadership qualities. He was both good at the front of house and the back of house stuff, whereas usually leaders do one or the other. He was thought by Walter Citrine, who was the General Secretary of the Trade Union, the TUC in the 1930s, to be the best negotiator he'd ever met in his life. Ernie was brilliant, not only at being very good at the negotiating table in getting things for his members, but he also had a very, very shrewd sense of what was the limit of what could be achieved. He was good at being in the other person's shoes and then using that as his benchmark. He was very ambitious, but never over the top. And he had a very good sense of how far he could push things. And he did get a whole series of, in terms of the day, really very good deals for his members. That's the first thing. The second thing is he was a very good and passionate speaker, an unusual speaker. He very rarely used notes and was extremely blunt. I mean, and Michael Foot famously said that watching a speech by Ernie Bevin was like watching a public execution with all of the hand gestures and everything else. You were transfixed by what was happening at the act. And he was a very big man, huge physical presence, like Churchill actually, but even more so, which had an impact too. But he had the right combination of extreme assertiveness, but genuine concern for other people. The stories are legion of his consideration to people who worked for him, particularly people who worked for him in lesser capacities. He was always chatting, and he was Foreign Secretary, with the lift man and the guy keeping the door. He was worried when he saw that there wasn't anywhere for the doorkeeper in the Foreign Office in the winter to sit, which was warm, and he had a special cubicle made for him with a heater in there. It's exactly the kind of thing Ernie Bevin would notice, which earned undying affection for those who worked for him. He inspired huge loyalty because he gave huge loyalty too. His deputies at the Transport General Workers Union all worshipped him. The guy who became his successor as General Secretary, actually his personal mannerisms, including the cigars he smoked, the way he dressed and all of that was modelled on Ernie, for whom he had worked for 25 years. And though he could be very difficult with colleagues, he's very good with supporting, very difficult with colleagues, where he had a working relationship that needed to be fostered, he was extremely good at maintaining it. And it's no accident that for 16 years, until his death in 1951, he had a very close working relationship with Attlee, so close that every time Herbert Morrison or Stafford Cripps or any of these other big beasts started trying to make a move against Attlee, which happened because Attlee was seen at the time as being a lesser figure in terms of his personality and all that than those other figures, Ernie always stamped on it. There were 7 attempts to remove Attlee between 1935 and 1950. Every single one of them was quashed by Ernie Bevin, even though 2 or 3, by my estimate, could easily have succeeded if he hadn't intervened. And 1 or 2 of them could even have resulted in Bevin becoming leader. But he was having none of it. Having decided that Clem, as he put it, was the guy to lead the Labour Party, he gave him his total loyalty. And he did the same in the whole 5 years of the wartime coalition to Churchill. And even though he and Churchill had been almost at daggers drawn in the 1920s until the mid-1930s, they come closer together because of their shared understanding of Hitler and opposition to appeasement. But from 1940 to 45, they remain very, very close associates, and total loyalty between the two of them, actually, even though Bevin himself doesn't particularly like Churchill and can be quite cutting about him in private, but he always separated that from what he needed to do in the job. I think that a final comment I'd make about him is I'm very struck. Oh, by the way, he also never resigned. Ernie Bevin never resigned from anyone. He outlived everyone. You said, Kezia, that he had 3 American secretaries of state. The first 2, Jimmy Burns and George Marshall, both left because they were exhausted and had enough after 2 years each. Ernie was 6 years as Foreign Secretary and literally all but died in the job. He was Minister of Labour all the way through the Second World War. He was General Secretary of the Transport and General Workers Union for 23 years. For 31 consecutive years, he was doing a post of massive responsibility. By the way, he has that in common with Churchill, who also never resigned. Both of them outlived all the people they were fighting against, even if they didn't win all of the short-term battles. They had a staying power that was enormously strong. And my final remark about Ernie is that what I was so struck by, looking at his career all the way through, was that he could be difficult. He didn't get everything right and all of that, but he was totally dedicated and totally professional. And those are two quite rare qualities in my experience of people who hold top jobs. And you just need to look, we're speaking just after this American presidential election with one of the least professional people ever to hold the office of president. And if I can be slightly controversial, some people might think the same about the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Well, nobody ever doubted that Ernie Bevin was totally on top of his brief, dedicated, loyal, professional, and those were actually great qualities of British government in the 1940s. And I think it's part of the reason why the wartime coalition of 1940 to 45 and the Attlee government of 1945 to 51 are two of the best governments that we've had in the history of the country, because not that they got everything right, but the people who led them, and the three people in particular, the three absolutely critical people, Churchill, Attlee and Bevin, were absolutely professional and dedicated to their jobs, and those are rare qualities.
So you reflect in the book, and you've just spoken a little bit about it there, about his longevity in public life. So he's leader of the TNG, and I have a very specific question for you about trade unions in a second, but he's leader of the TNG, and from that he becomes the Minister for Labour before becoming the Foreign Secretary, 3 offices in 34 years. You remark in the book that he is, without question, the longest serving senior politician in the 21st century, out-serving Churchill, out-serving Margaret Thatcher. I just wonder if you can reflect to us on why he doesn't have the prominence in our kind of popular history that he perhaps should have, and whether that was the motivation for writing the book.
It definitely was. And indeed, it's not just he doesn't have the prominence, but many people, particularly Labour people, confuse Bevin and Bevan. Indeed, the Wikipedia entry on Ernie Bevin says not to be confused with Anara and Bevan. Now, Bevin, actually, I'm not seeking to put people in order. I think that's a sort of slightly pointless thing to do. Nye Bevin was a very great figure. The guy who founded the National Health Service, clearly, both for Labour people, but also in national life, is a very big figure. But founding NATO is I would say, equally big. A successful country has its security safeguarded and has its society safeguarded. And what makes that 1945 Labour government so great, and why it will always live in history, is it founds both the welfare state and NATO and the security relationships, which see that we don't have another war. And nothing does more to destroy national economies than war, let alone societies. And the 1945 government protects society, and it also protects Britain's security. But therein lies the reason why he's always played second fiddle to Nye, and to largely written out of the script as far as the Labour Party is concerned, because of course the Labour Party has always had a very ambivalent relationship with defence, security, NATO, all of that. We've just come out of the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, who didn't much like the idea of NATO at all. And the left of the Labour Party at the time was fiercely opposed to Bevin's foreign policy, fiercely opposed. Michael Foot and Richard Crossman and the Keep Left group thought that Bevin's policy was warlike, even though actually what it was seeking to do was to secure against what could have been, and would probably have been without him, a war stimulated by Stalin. And also they were very ambivalent on the communist issue until, indeed, all the way through until the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989. A significant strand of the left, and a very significant strand in the 1940s, was either communist or pro-communist. And that included quite a number of Labour MPs in 1945. And as Ernie used to say, particularly those who've got no experience of communists. That was his, it was he says, I've dealt with them all the time. When he first meets Stalin at the Potsdam Conference in 1945, he says he's just like the guy who used to run the Holloway bus branch of the TNG, who was a communist and was just like Stalin in appearance and manner, and extremely aggressive communism. He had no truck with that at all, and was a fierce anti-communist, which gave him big problems on the left. Actually, he shared that with Attlee, that Attlee was just a bit more diplomatic and skillful about what he said in public, but they shared the same views in private. So for all of those reasons, his name was confused with Bevin. He did, as it were, the tough business of the Labour government and Labour politics, not the bit that everyone on the Labour side agreed with, and he was fiercely anti-communist. For all of those reasons, he didn't have the prominence of Nye Bevin. But there was also, because there's always a big element of fate in these things as well. The fact that he died in 1951 meant he had no opportunity to cultivate his own reputation. Nye Bevin lives for another 10 years, writes In Place of Fear, and Michael Foot writes a hagiographical life of him. No one does that for Ernie Bevin. He can't do it himself because he's dead, and no one else does it. And there is a 3-volume biography of Ernie Bevin by Lord Bullock. It's far too long and far too detailed. Nobody reads 2,500 pages on anyone, really. But also it's very academic. It says almost nothing, for example, about Bevin the man, very little about his family. Flo, his wife, gets only, I think, 4 mentions in all 3 volumes. There's far more about Flo and his daughter Queenie in my books. I always regard families as hugely important in understanding how politicians and anyone who reaches prominence, how they behave. And he never had this great, almost cult-like following that Nye Bevin had after 1951. But my view of it, for those of you who are in Labour politics, is that the success of the 1945 government, and indeed post-war Labourism, is equally due to Bevin and Bevin. And if Labour is going to be successful in future and get re-elected, as I hope it will under Keir Starmer, it will be not only because it has great social policies, but also because it can be trusted with defence, security, military affairs, and isn't regarded as weak and suspect, which unfortunately Labour has been for far too much of its history, including its recent history in the 2010s, particularly under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership.
Okay, Andrew, the next few questions I've got for you are very much about how Bevin sits in the context of the modern day, and I'm desperate to get to those. But before we leave what happened in the 40s and 50s, we've had a really interesting question from Martin Newell, who says, why was Bevin not a pacifist? Like so many in post First World War, he must have lost friends in the war, and Martin references Via Britain. Pacifism was ubiquitous at the time. Why wasn't he one?
It wasn't ubiquitous. Pacifism divided the left pretty evenly in the big Labour and TUC conferences of the 20s and 30s. What's so striking is that the arguments are roughly equal on both sides, and the votes are often very close on whether or not Labour should go in a pacifist direction or not. And why was Ernie not a pacifist? Because he believed that dictators had to be stood up to. It was a straightforward understanding of power, and he sees this more clearly than most figures on the Labour side in the 1930s, except Attlee, who had fought in the First World War, was actually in the Dardanelles, who has a similar view of power and human nature, and maybe it's more rooted in a view of human nature. Ernie, being a Methodist lay preacher, he understands human failings, has a very, very good sense of them. He certainly doesn't believe, like Lansbury, who's the guy who gets out of the Labour leadership, who's kind of Corbyn pacifist before 1935, that peace and goodwill and being nice to dictators is going to get them to behave well. And he sees with very great clarity that if the League of Nations fails in 1935 when Mussolini invades Abyssinia, Ethiopia as it now is, that this will lead to a chain reaction of the other dictators in Europe, particularly Hitler, seeking to do the same, which is precisely what happens. It's after the League breaks down on the issue of military force to stop Mussolini invading Ethiopia. When it breaks down on that, Hitler immediately occupies the Rhineland, militarizes it, though the Versailles Treaty had said that it had to be demilitarized. He shrewdly works out that he can get away with it because if the Western powers, Western democracies, Britain, France and the United States aren't going to stop Mussolini, who's a much smaller figure, from invading Ethiopia, which after all is a North African country, which Britain could have moved in quite quickly to have stopped. If they're not going to do that, then he can get away with it, first of all, in the Rhineland, and then, of course, that leads in due course the annexation of Austria, the invasion of Czechoslovakia, the Munich deal, and so on. So I think it's partly an analysis of human nature, partly his understanding of the dictators, partly his understanding of communism. It was all of those coming together, which meant that he was never a pacifist. However, he wasn't a great fan of wars. He was actually against the First World War. He thought it was a mistake of Asquith and Grey to go in the First World War. He thought that the issues involved could and should have been resolved diplomatically. He had quite a shrewd judgment, and his policy after 1945 was to carry a big stick, which he sought to do, but by that process to avoid war, and he did that fairly successfully.
Andrew, we've got about 15 minutes left of your time, so I'm desperate to bring us up to the modern day and look at his life in the context of what we're faced with now. And I'm keen to ask you specifically about the modern role of trade unions. In the book, you say the Bevin of Britain today would be organising millions of low-paid workers, particularly the 5 million strong and largely non-unionised social care and gig economy sectors, maybe by creating a new general union on the scale of the T&G of the years gone by. I wonder if you could reflect for us in just a couple of minutes before we move on to two other kind of modern day questions, why there is no Bevin of 2020 doing that today. And it flows on from a question that we've had from Professor Jim Phillips, who's a professor in economic and social history at the University of Glasgow, who poses in far simpler and more concise words whether Bevin was a champion of non-organised workers.
Well, it's a very, very good question. His aim was to try and get non-unionised workers to join unions, and he was certainly a great believer in collective bargaining and was against minimum wages, interestingly, because he thought it would weaken trade unions, and they'd be very low. He thought the minimum wages would be very low if they were set through wage boards, and it would weaken trade unions. Having said which, he was the agreements that he reached were sector-wide agreements, and he did believe in the role of the state in creating what he called tripartism, which was unions, employers, but with a legal regime, including the obligation on employers to negotiate, and the setting up of wages councils, which were a big creation of Ernest in the 1940s, which lasted all the way until Thatcher abolished them in 1986. So they were a big part of the post-war infrastructure. And those wages councils did set wages for whole sectors, not just for the unionised members of them. So though he was a trade unionist first and foremost, he was always sought to encourage people to join unions. And actually, I think he was probably quite shrewd in that he did understand that unless the working class was organised, then ultimately it wouldn't be able to win power politically. So I think he did have a certain shrewdness there. Nonetheless, he wasn't chauvinistic to the degree of not wanting a fair deal for people who weren't in unions. But his instinct when he saw a dispossessed group was to unionize it. And all I can say is, I wish Len McCluskey, who is the successor, amazingly this, Len McCluskey is the successor to Ernie Bevin, because Unite is what was the Transport and General Workers Union. I wish Len McCluskey took the same attitude, because if he did, Unite might be the union out there unionising these 5 million gig workers and care workers who are largely ununionised at the moment, and they might therefore get a much, much better deal. Whereas, if I can be slightly controversial for a moment, what Len has spent the last 10 years doing instead is organising the left of the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn. And I don't think that's made that big a contribution to the well-being of the working class.
My next question is about heroes and villains, and given that the John Smith Centre is a non-partisan organisation, I'm not going to slot any of the names that you have mentioned thus far into either the hero or the villain column, other than to say how unhelpful a categorisation that can be sometimes, and how history romanticises people as either good or bad when the truth is obviously much more complex than that. And I just wondered how you would address this particular point. I worry sometimes that, in highlighting the towering figures of our past, we kind of glorify what political leaders used to look like. And I just wonder, what your advice to young people engaged or looking at the political world today would be, given the despairing state of politics as we see it in the country just now.
Well, I think it's always a good thing to understand a bit about the past. And the reason I think for understanding people like Ernie Bevin isn't to hero worship them, because I don't think that's particularly profitable, but to understand them. And it's through understanding them also that it gives you a sense of the realm of the possible. Until I actually started writing about Ernie Bevin, so, because I always find that writing is a good way of really understanding what's going on, I hadn't realised quite what an extraordinary achievement setting up the Transport and General Workers Union was. And it's that focused me on what you asked me about a moment ago, Kezia, about what would a modern trade union leader be doing. And so I often find that looking at great leaders in the past, people who have made a big impact on their own age, can be inspiration, not in the sense of making you think that you need to do things just in the way that they did and everything they did was right, but in giving you ideas for things that are very much relevant today and could be recycled or reinterpreted and applied in today's world. And that's one very good example. It's much clearer to me, having written about Ernie Bevin, that the weakness of the trade union movement, unions today have only half the membership that they had in 1979, which was, as it were, at the end of the Bevin period of very dominant unions in our national life. Understanding that gave me a much sharper sense of the need for the unions to revive if the Labour movement and the Labour Party are going to revive, that the two need to be seen together. However, it's also very important to understand the great failings of these figures. I don't dodge for a moment in the book Bevin's failings, including one that is very great contemporary relevance. Bevin was a raging anti-Semite, and Lord Bullock, the previous biographer of Bevin, who did hero worship Bevin, glossed over all of that. He didn't quote many of the things that Bevin did and said, particularly about the formation of the State of Israel, which Bevin fought tooth and nail against because Britain was the colonial power in Palestine before 1947 and refused to countenance. Ernie Bevin, refused to countenance the foundation of Israel and a two-state solution, that this was rooted in anti-Semitism and quite deep anti-Semitism too. And actually, again, understanding that Bevin and indeed Attlee, though this isn't much discussed in Labour circles, were both quite deeply anti-Semitic, puts again in relief the problems that the Labour Party has been having on anti-Semitism in the last 10 years, because this is not a new thing, unfortunately. It's quite deeply rooted in left-wing politics. This dislike of rich Jews, which Bevin felt very strongly, that goes back a long way, much further than I'd realised. And again, I painted the picture, warts and all. There's 5 pages of the book where I go into all this, including quoting things that Ernie said and did, which are quite shocking to the modern eye, but I think need to be known, because we've got to guard against this, and understanding how deeply rooted anti-Semitism is quite important to dealing with it in the present day.
Andrew, thank you for doing that. I think we needed to hear that in that context of historical figures not being just heroes or villains. I'm sure that most people watching tonight have come hoping to escape COVID-19 and any reference whatsoever of coronavirus. But I'm afraid my final question for you tonight is going to be about exactly that, because you closed the book talking about the coronavirus. You say in the closing paragraph, in fact, that Bevin would have relished the kind of emergency that coronavirus poses. And you quote the proverb, "Where there is no vision, the people perish." Why do you think he would have relished this particular crisis that we're faced with?
Well, he would have relished it, not in the sense that he would have welcomed it, but he would have relished it in that he was a great organiser dealing with crises. Ernie Bevin is at his best in a crisis. He is cool, calm, a really serious organiser. He's thoroughly professional, as I said earlier. He was always travelling. I know exactly what Ernie would have done in this crisis. He would have got around the country. We wouldn't have had this ludicrous spectacle of the First Minister of Scotland and the Mayor of Greater Manchester having no relationship with the Prime Minister in London, who's never been even to see them. Ernie would have been there. He would have been in Edinburgh. He would have spoken to the Scottish Parliament. He would have turned up in Manchester Town Hall, on his home turf, and done meetings with with Andy Burnham, and he would have been very, very close to the experts because he always knew what he didn't know. The sheer professionalism and the commitment which Ernie had to doing jobs well would have come to the fore. And one of the things that's really depressing about the handling of this crisis is the sheer amateurishness and almost hostility to dealing with other politicians, devolved administrations, professionals and experts that we've had from our present government. Which is part of the populist thing, unfortunately, because part of this populist movement that we've seen in the last 10 years, hopefully is now in retreat. But part of it is a kind of contempt for experts, you know, as Michael Gove said, we've had enough of experts, and rival centres of power. Whereas Ernest Bevin was a realist about other centres of power, he would have been completely realistic about the fact that though he had big disagreements with Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland politically, nonetheless, they both had to work together because it's a big national crisis. And he would have done the same with the mayors across England too. His sheer professionalism would have shone through, and that professionalism would have instilled confidence in Whitehall and Westminster, and I think also would have given the public a strong sense, very much like, for example, the German public has with Angela Merkel, that there's a really serious, responsible, grown up in charge in this crisis. And it has to be said that that isn't the feeling that most of the British people have about their governments at the present time. But sorry to end on a positive note. The next Bevin, I'm sure, will restore the confidence in which Whitehall and Westminster were held across the United Kingdom.
Andrew, that's just been wonderful, and you know the passion that you show for his life really shines through when you speak about it, and we're hugely grateful to you for your time and for your insights. And you opened by saying to everybody who was watching that it is possible for them to access a signed copy of your book by emailing you with the appropriate financial arrangements to be agreed between yourself and those watching. People can still access those details in the chat forum there. And it's only now really for me to say that if you are watching and listening to this event and you have a Glasgow University email address, you have an exclusive invite to our next event at the John Smith Centre, which is this coming Wednesday at 4 p.m, where we're going to be meeting with the leading Democratic pollster and former Clinton campaign director, Joe Benison, who's going to answer the question, what just happened in the US elections, and hopefully we will have an answer by then. And if you don't have a University of Glasgow email address, our Power Hour series will be back in the new year. And if you have all of those or neither of those, we'd be very grateful to you if you could take a moment after this event to complete this survey, which is about to appear on your screen. So thank you so much, Andrew. Thanks to everyone for watching, and good night. Bye for now.
Thanks, and have a great evening, everyone, and great to be with you. Thanks very much.